We'll now start talking about theme development. So how to create orchard extensions that serve the site's look and feel. And this is a pretty important topic because I think that pretty much every website needs its own theme. Well, not necessarily something groundbreaking, but still something unique because, well, that's the branding of the website. So that's the extension we will develop first. But before that, we will need a bit of explanation of how Orchard's layout works. Remember that we are currently using the so-called full CMS. So the whole application, the backend, as well as the frontend is driven by Orchard. You could also utilize the decoupled version, where Orchard only runs the backend, and you write the frontend yourself, well, for example, in Razor Pages. And then from Razor Pages, you can fetch data from the Orchard backend via various APIs. You could also do that. Then there is not much to learn about Orchard regarding the front-end. You just have to learn the Orchard APIs. But in the full CMS case, Orchard also drives the front-end, so we also have to understand how Orchard actually builds the layout. And of course, there are advantages and drawbacks to both approaches, meaning the full CMS and the decoupled one. The advantage of the full CMS is that, of course, there is everything already there. Not necessarily everything how you want it though, and that's what we'll also understand how to override pieces of Orchard, but just those pieces that you want to be changed. And we are now looking at an application setup with the full Orchard source code again, because we will do a little bit of debugging. Now, again, we have a block here, super simple. Now the question is, where are all these pieces of HTML that drives this website coming from? And as we have seen, they are coming from CSHTML files and themes. So if we go back to our solution, what actually drives this front end now is not the theme, which will switch over soon, but the block theme. And as we have seen, is the crucial difference between the two is that the block theme has liquid markup files, and the theme has CSHTML Razor templates. And this is why we'll switch over the theme because we'll want to do a little bit of debugging, not debugging because we are searching for problems, but rather because that way we can understand the whole thing a bit better. So now I'm switching over to the theme, which is here called the default theme. And now that is done, let's open the front end again, and let's go back to our code once it loads. Okay, as you see, there is nothing really nice of a styling here. Well, because the theme is a basic default theme, and it's very generic, so it's not that suitable for a blog than the block theme. But let's switch over to the code, and let's see what's in the theme, and maybe we can understand something better of Orchard with this. Well, first of all, there is this layout.cshtml. And if you open it, you see that, well, it contains an HTML document. So this is pretty much the CSHTML file that is in the root or at the top, however you would like to look at it, of the whole rendering of the website. And you see, we have standard HTML here, but right at the beginning we also have some Orchard related things, little pieces of the Orchard API. Like this Orchard.culture name here is, well, returning the name of the current culture, the culture of the current request, or if there is nothing else, the default site culture. And in the head, we have a couple of interesting things as well. like this is how Orchard generates the full title tag. And this is how you can include static resources and display them, but we'll take a look at these later. And here's the full body. Now, Orchard is very modular in its layout as well. So the layout is built of little building blocks, little pieces of markup, all coming together. And those pieces of markups can come from a variety of places. They can come from the theme, like here, but modules can contribute such markup as well. And commonly, how you develop a module, that it contains everything it needs to actually function. So it contains all the markup files, it contains all the CSS, JavaScript, and whatever. And in the theme, you just override what you want to customize for that specific website. And because of this modularization, you see that, well, the body here hardly contains a lot of HTML. So this is not the full site that we are seeing here. And of course not, because, well, all the little pieces are coming from different places. And what the layout does is rather that it orchestrates everything together and displays the whole thing in a structure. And well, that's what you can see here. This render section header or messages or footer or even render body is rendering different zones. Remember that we talked about zones with themes? Now these are the zones that we talked about then. These are the zones where you can put widgets into. And these are also zones where shapes can be displayed. Now, I just use a new word called shape. What is a shape? A shape in Orchard terminology, and I think this is basically Orchard specific. A shape in Orchard is basically a little dynamic view model that is created somewhere in the system, and all of these dynamic view models then in the end come together into a tree of shapes. And the tree of shapes in the end will be somehow rendered in, well, for example, HTML. Not necessarily, but most possibly in HTML. In the end, what this means is that pieces of logic behind the scenes sometimes create shapes. Not all of them, but sometimes create shapes. Those shapes contain everything that a view model contains and a lot more things, because shapes can contain and store a lot more data, like classes or an ID. And at the end, those shapes will somehow be rendered. There can be even methods that render shapes, so that write HTML, but commonly a shape will correspond to a template, and that template will commonly be a razor template. So this is actually a layout shape template. This is the template corresponding to the layout shape. Now, if you want to understand shapes a bit better, we have a good example of it right away, which is the menu item shape. Or rather, what we are looking at right now is not the shape itself, but the menu item shape template, the template that will render the menu item shape. And of course, the menu item shape is about displaying a menu item on the front-end menu. So what we can do here is that we can put a breakpoint somewhere here and debug how the whole thing works. Let the application run and let's see what happens. Because if you take a look at under the hood, you can understand a lot of things better. So I will create a breakpoint somewhere here. The exact location doesn't really matter. The application is already running, so I will just attach Visual Studio to IS Express. And now that it is done, let's go back to the browser. So let's refresh the site. And our breakpoint is hit. That's great. Well, let's check out the call stack here. So where did we get to from here? But actually before that, let's take a bit of time here. You see that we have a model property here. Well, of course, this model as usual in ASP.NET MVC views, but if we take a bit better look at it, I'm opening up locals, so we have a better view. Then we will see that this model actually contains a shape object. So we have a shape here. The shape is actually the whole view model of this template. And remember that I said that shapes can have more data than standard view models, where that's actually what's happening here. Shapes can, out of the box, also contain attributes, HTML attributes, classes, they can have an ID, etc. And they have these dynamic properties here. So shapes are dynamic objects. That's quite important. Well, and it's not just important, but it's also apparent here because there is no casting for the model in this template. So let's go back to here. You see that we have several dynamic properties here. And actually, we have one for the content item, because remember that menus and menu items are also content items, so we have the corresponding content item object. Don't worry, we'll check them out later when we are creating our first module. And we also have some other properties here that are more traditional to a view model. So just as in MVC in general, in Orchard, shapes also contain such pre-processed data that you normally pass to view models. And by the way, we are using shapes here. You can use shapes, but you are not obligated to use shapes in your own code. You can just use standard view models as you wish. And actually, that's what happens in most of the cases when there is an editor displayed. So when there is a content part and it displays a piece of the form, that editor is usually backed by a view model. A lot of the cases, even the display is backed by a view model. Sometimes that uses a shape. But in any case, there is somewhere a shape there that will correspond to the end result. And well, as you can see, we are in a menu item, so the level is in a property as well. It can be a hierarchical menu, as well as we have a reference to the menu shape, which is, well, the whole menu. So now we are inside the menu item, but this is a reference to the parent menu. And as you can see, well, that is our main menu. So we can have such a kind of a hierarchy between shapes as well. And now if we look at the call stack, we will see a lot of scary things. But we shouldn't get scared because we know what happens here. Well, we'll know in a minute. At the top of the call stack, we have the template where we are at. These are a bit scary names because, you know, these CS/HTML files are compiled to C# in the end by the Razor compiler. So there are classes and whatnot generated automatically, but the names are telltale nevertheless. We know that, well, this is menu item still. Then there are a lot of things that we don't necessarily care about from the inner workings of the Orchard display management. And the next interesting thing is that there is a menu. A menu templates entry here, and here we are. And what's happening here? We are now in menu.cshtml, which is, by the way, also here overridden in the theme, or in the default theme. And this menu.cshtml is actually displaying these menu item shapes. So you see, when a shape is bound to a CSS/HTML file or a liquid template, it can happen as late as this as well. From your shape, you can also display other shapes. And we'll also take a look at this in a bit more detail. And if we go down in the call stack more, we'll also arrive here. Well, this is not yet interesting, but here in layout.cshtml. And well, this is not exactly the right place where this call originated from, but actually from here. So here we have a menu tag helper. Orchard operates with Razor tag helpers. So for a lot of common scenarios like displaying menus, like you see here, we have such tag-like tag helpers. They're very convenient. As you can see, it looks like HTML. They have IntelliSense for it and everything. And you see this menu here is displayed by this menu tag helper. So actually, in the end, what happened is that Orchard displayed the layout shape. Then the layout shape displayed the menu, the menu through the menu tag helper. And then the menu displayed the menu item shape. So there was this call stack or this call chain, if you wish, to display everything in the end. And one more thing here. Notice that the menu tag helper also has this cache something attributes here. This is shape caching. Shape caching in Orchard is, well, a way to cache the output of shapes. If you know do not caching or do not whole caching, this is basically it. The whole layout is usually rendered in its entirety, but pieces of the whole layout can be cached individually. And that's very useful and very flexible. Well, useful because, of course, caching makes things faster, if done right. And secondly, since this is do not caching, it will work even if pieces of the layout change. Because, well, here we cache the menu for 5 minutes. By the way, this is 5 minutes if nothing else happens. If you change the menu, then the cache will be cleared. But otherwise, it's cached for 5 minutes. Well, does that mean that everything has to adhere to this 5 minutes? And of course not, because this is just do not caching. The menu itself is cached for 5 minutes. Everything else on the layout can be cached differently or can operate without caches. Menus are cached because commonly menus can be quite complex and take a bit of time to be generated. Of course, if you have a trivial menu, like on the blog recipe creates just a 2-item menu, that's not necessarily something that you need to cache, but always check. So don't just do caching because maybe that will help. It can actually make things slower. It can slow your web servers. It can put pressure onto the web server's memory. So check out what works for you, and do note that you have options here. Now, this is all good, but why did we try to understand these things here? Well, because as a next step, we will override shape templates here. In our own theme, we will create our own shape templates that override specific pieces of the Orchard layout. And the theme that we are seeing here actually does already that, because you see we have these menu and menu items CSS/HTMLs here, but these are actually not the only ones. If we search for menu.cshtml, for example, then we see that, well, there are multiple menu.cshtml files. Here is the one in our theme, but here is the original one. And this original one comes from the module, from the menu module. So modules have their own shape templates out of the box there. And then if you want to change in the behavior of the shape template somehow, then you can simply copy-paste them by the same name and put them into the theme. or you can do a lot more. That's what we'll see next.